Hi, this is Sabrina from A Space to Create Art, and today we're going to look at an abstract watercolor exploration where students get to explore color blending, texture, patterning, repetition, and unity. Have fun creating with your students.
So just a little bit about color before we start. There are three primary colors: red, blue, and yellow. And different paints will give you the best versions of secondary and tertiary colors. So if we're talking about secondary colors, we have orange, violet, and green. And in order to create the most vibrant orange, there are different kinds of paint or different colors of paint that you can use to get that most vibrant orange. And the ones that we're using is CAD Red Light and Gamboge Yellow. You can also use CAD Red Medium and CAD Yellow Medium. We're using alizarin crimson and cobalt blue to create the most vibrant violet, and we're going to use pale yellow hue and phthalo blue to create the most vibrant green. I also use violet, mauve, and pink in this particular abstract composition. You may use different colors. So let's get started. With this particular composition, you should try to just have fun and explore the different ways that you can use watercolor. Some of the things that you want to try for are doing some wet on wet mixing, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to take a little bit of the violet and put it down on my paper. Also kind of explore at the same time some of the different things that I can do with my flat brush. Another good idea would be to use some patterning, which is just repeated elements, whether they be line, shapes, or colors. Inside the violet, I'm going to add some phthalo blue. So this is what it looks like to do some wet and wet mixing. Let's go with a color that you can see a little bit better. Let's try some red. Wet. There you go. So that's what it looks like when you put wet watercolor paint down on wet watercolor paint. It kind of does its own thing and it looks beautiful. This one was a little bit drier when I put it down, so I'm just going to add a little bit of water and let it do its thing. Maybe push it out a little bit. And this is nice and wet. It's a nice puddle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change brushes. So I'm going from my flat brush to a round number 6, and I'm going to grab some Gamboge yellow, and I'm going to drop it into that red. Let's see how that works. So really what this lesson is about is playing with colors, but also playing with patterning and ways to create a unified composition through shape, line, and color. So let's see, I like what I got going on here. This looks a little bit like a fire. Speaking of that though, one of the things that you want to do with this particular lesson is you want to stay away from doing anything that's representational. So you want it to stay abstract. So by abstract I mean non-representational, like no deliberate flames for a fire, no like flowers or smiley faces. You kind of just want to stay with just the elements of art, which are line, shape, color, repetition, and pattern are principles of art. So anyway, I'm going to keep going here. Let's see, try some of my pale yellow hue with the. One of the things you do want to think about when you're doing this is what kind of composition do you want to create? Do you want to create a nice, vibrant composition? And if so, make sure that you're choosing colors that mix well together. Like I know that this phthalo and pale yellow hue create a beautiful green. I also know that violet and yellow, since they're complementary colors or across from each other on the color wheel, are going to create almost like a neutral color, like a brown or a gray. And since I want to keep my composition bright, I think I'm going to stay away from mixing any yellow into my violet. But I am going to come back with some phthalo blue here and let it kind of mingle with the violet. And a bit of, I think there's a little bit of yellow on my brush. It's creating this really pretty teal. Okay, one of the other things we talked about was doing some dots. Dots are really cool because they can help unify a painting, and they just add a little bit of visual interest. We also want to try to create some texture. One way to do that is by using a dry brush technique. So if you kind of put down your brush and then pull it through, let it kind of dry as it's going onto the paper, you can see that it creates this texture. They use that a lot to create bark on trees or wooden planks. You can also use it to create the illusion of sunlight on water. So now I'm just going to play, and the important thing is that you explore color, see what happens when you mix certain colors together, and also explore creating an interesting composition that maintains unity in some way. And by unity, I just mean it looks like it's finished. When you're done, it looks like, right now, my composition still looks like it needs some help. So I'm going to keep going on it. When you'll know, you kind of know unity, when you'll know when it's done, when you can feel it. So I'm just going to keep filling up my page with a little bit of red down there. I'm going to try some cobalt blue, make my own version of violet. I'm going to take some phthalo blue. And then I'm going to play around with my brush a little bit over here, just putting it down in different directions. And it just splattered a little bit. You can take your paintbrush and do a little bit of a splatter if you want. Try not to be too messy. When you don't splatter like just throwing the brush, you just kind of gently knock it against your finger and you'll get some nice drops. Sometimes just the splatter can help unify a painting. And so I'm just dropping wet paint down. So then I'm going to maybe do, I just want to balance out my warmer colors. I'm just going to do a little bit of a, this is called a liner brush. So I'm going to drop it a little bit. Drying off the tip of it a tad, maybe adding a tad bit of water. I want to get some thin lines going. And this is actually the best brush to do this with. This is actually the way, it's like a little bit of a flick. This is the way that you do grass in watercolor or in acrylic paint. Create grass or weeds. Then I want you to try to do, this is also called, this is wet on dry. So you're taking wet paint on dry paint and you're creating some detail in the actual painting once it's dry. Okay, so that's called wet on dry. Be good for you to try that. And I'm going to take a little bit of yellow. One of the things that you want to do is you want to take your time and try to do some cool things with this assignment. It looks like when you first start doing it that it would be super easy, and it should be, but you also want to just be aware of thinking about some of those elements and principles of art and how you're using them as you're creating this. Are you using repetition? Repetition is repeated elements, like these lines up here, like this purple pattern I did over there. Are you creating a pattern? Are you creating rhythm and variety? And rhythm is created through the use of repetition and variety. So variety is simply just, you know, different line types, different shapes, and all of those things actually are amazing because when you start using them in your art, your artwork gets better. It gets more visually interesting, and this is a great way to start exploring that, those elements and principles and how they can change the way your artwork looks and how it feels. So I let my students do this more than once. I don't know if your teacher wants you to do that or not, but the most important thing is to have fun with it. And after we get all of the painting done, we're going to let it dry and we're going to add some more variety by adding some ink work on top of the painted parts. So I'm going to let this dry for a little while and I'll come back and we'll do a little bit of ink work on it. And then we'll be ready. I'm going to get a little bit more pink over here. And then we'll be ready to finish this up. And it'll be your turn to do an amazing abstract watercolor painting. Okay, let it dry and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we've switched over. This is nice and dry now. I have some micron pens. They're different sizes. 01 is the smallest, very thin lines. 03 is kind of a medium thin, and then a 05 is similar to an ultra fine tip Sharpie. And if you don't have these pens in your classroom, that's fine. You can use Sharpies and they work just as well, really. So now what I want to do is I want to just come in and I want to add some detail with ink. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about a couple of things when we started the lesson that we wanted to see in your painting. So we talked about doing a wet on wet blend, and you can see there's a couple of different areas where you can see that wet and wet paint, where I dropped wet paint into wet paint. I wanted to see a little bit of wet on dry detail work, which you can see with this red. We wanted to see some patterning, and you can see some patterning all over this area, which is just repeated elements. We wanted to see some texture of some sort, which you can see with the dry brush technique that I created, as well as creating these kind of grass-like leaves, creates an implied texture. And then we just wanted to do a piece that had unity, okay? And I do feel like this piece has unity. It feels almost finished. I think it's going to look even better once I start putting some ink work on it. We don't want to create like Zentangles on this particular art piece. We want to try to keep it organic, try to keep it abstract. So one of the things that you can do is just go in and start outlining the shapes that you created with your paint, where the color shifts, where you see white dots, the edges of your painting. You can create some lines that attach dots to other pieces of your painting, which always kind of looks cool. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to just kind of define the edges of my paint. This is just a good way to get yourself started. When you do this, it becomes almost meditative if you just kind of let yourself get lost in the different shapes that were created and outline them. And you really find that as you put in this ink detail, the painting gets better and better. And so this is one of my finished paintings. You can see I added a lot more detail in here. I did some more with my brushes. I outlined some of the thinner lines. So have fun with this one. It's really all about exploring color, shapes, lines, repetition, and unity.
This is Sabrina from A Space to Create Art.